The Black Man of the Nile and His Family, Part 2. It is very deep significance to begin the identification of the Africans by citing certain major quotations about them. There could be no better way to start than with the writings of an Englishman named Thomas Hodgkin, former secretary of the Oxford University Delegacy for Extramural Studies and a fellow of Balliol College, Oxford. The quotation from Mr. Hodgkin stems from an article that appeared in The Highway, February 1952, pages 169 through 170, under the title National Movement in West Africa. It is no doubt flattering to our vanity to imagine that the peoples of Africa were primitive and barbarous before the penetration of the Europeans, and it was we who have civilized them, but it is a theory that lacks historical foundation. The Empire of Ghana flourished in what is now French West Africa during the Dark Ages of Western Europe. By the 15th century, there was a university at Timbuktu. The Ashantis of the Gold Coast and the Yorubas of Nigeria possessed highly organized and complex civilizations long before their territories were brought under British political control. The thesis that Africa is what Western European missionaries, traders, technicians, and administrators have made it comforting to Western Europeans, but invalid. The eruption of Western European colonizers into Africa, with all the effects of their religion and their schools, their gin and their cotton goods, and their systems of administration, is only an event, though a very important event, the history of the African peoples. If therefore we wish to understand the national movements that have emerged in Africa and have reached their most mature and advanced stage in West Africa, we have to begin to try to rid our minds of the European preconception that influence our thinking on this subject. This is not easy, since most of the available material on Africa affairs is presented from a European standpoint, either by imperial historians who are interested in the record of European penetration into Africa, or by colonial administrators who are interested in the pattern of instructions imposed by European governments upon African societies, or by the anthropologists who are often, though not always, mainly interested in the forms of social organizations thriving in the simplest African communities, considered in isolation from political developments in the world around them. We should probably have to wait a little while for the real history of Africa to be written by African scholars for an African reading public. The last sentence by Mr. Hodgkin, which this author has carefully underlined, is key to Black and African studies courses everywhere. But an author of African origin selects to paraphrase Mr. Hodgkin in the following manner. When African scholars interpret their own African history from an African perspective for an African reading public everywhere, including the United States of America, then and only then shall we have true African history. Mr. Hodgkin's revelations were brought to light on somewhat of an official basis. His response was to certain allegations made by Sir Hugh Clifford, former governor of Britain's West African colony, which the British had renamed Gold Coast Crown Colony, presently the Republic of Ghana. Writing in MOPOWERZ magazine, January 1918, and having very much to say about the Africans of the Gold Coast, Sir Clifford has stated, much of the most notable achievement that can be placed to his credit is his invention, without the insistence of an extraneous influence, of the democratic system of government which states socialism, which are the basic principles upon which his tribal policy is founded. Recent innovations, as I have indicated, tend seriously to undermine this system, and it is interesting to note that while European political theorists are apparently working their way back to a state of things closely resembling that which the TWI, Twi speaking peoples, long ago evolved from themselves, the latter are displaying an inclination to discard them as immediate and inevitable accomplishment of their first real and solid advance towards a higher standard of civilization. The vast majority of the Twa people are located around the nations of Liberia, Ghana, Guinea, and other West African nations within the same general area of the Gulf of Guinea and the former Ethiopian Atlantic Ocean. These are two most privileged first-hand accounts of great African high cultural civilizations on the part of two men who are in position to know the truth, but this working is dealing primarily with man's cultural and historical development, which in this case are the Africans. Therefore, are those two who, for various reasons, do not accredit Africa's sons and daughters with being human, much less being able to produce human culture, civil traits, and societies, which all amounts to what is presently called civilization. This type of characterization has been perpetuated by certain learned men of scholars, otherwise called academians, such as one Professor M.D.W. Jeffries. This learned professor works, but more specifically his personal views about indigenous African peoples on their descendants everywhere were published in September 1951 issue of the West African Review under the title The Negro Enigma. It revealed a profound disregard for documentation, a picture of racist propaganda, and displayed an extraordinary gift for creating stereotypes. He wrote, "The Negro is divided linguistically into main groups, the Sudanic-speaking Negroes of West Africa and the Bantu-speaking Negroes of the Congo, East and South Africa. All are of one race and are remarkably uniform in appearance. The Black Belt, anthropologically speaking, it is an area on the Earth's surface that comprises the dark-skinned races, excluding the American Negroes who were brought there by Europeans. The Black Belt extends from Africa via India to Malaysia and Australia. In this great arc of position of the Negro is the enigma. At the two ends or horns are the people who are Negroes, but in the center there are none. The center is occupied by a dark-skinned race, the Hindu, but he offers no difficulty. He belongs to the same race as the Europeans, namely the Caucasians, the inhabitants of Europe, and dark-skinned Caucasians, the inhabitants of North Africa, Asia Minor, or India. Although Professor Jeffries at this juncture had established his racist hypotheses, he continued to expand his light and dark-skinned Caucasians to the point where he eliminated every one of the indigenous Africans, the so-called Sudanic and Bantu-speaking Negroes, from all of North and East Africa, and purified the area with a new population of dark-skinned Caucasians. Thus, he questioned, how comes it then that the East and the West India is flanked by Negroes? That is the puzzle, that there are Oceanic and African Negroes separated from each other by Arabia, India, and Malaysia. Let us review the problem from another angle. The Caucasians come from an old human stock, a stock that is today called modern man. Modern man goes back a long way in time. The swan's comb skull found in Great Britain is dated 250,000 years and is our stock, not Negro. The skeletal remains dug up by the Leakeys in East Africa are us, not Negro. Boskop man, found in the Cape, is dated 50,000 years and falls into our group, not that of the Negro. What is meant by Bantu-speaking Negroes? There is no language in any part of Africa by that name. The racist classification is partly responsible for much of the conclusion in the Seligman's Races of Africa, New York, 1930. There are no Negro skulls of antiquity. The oldest is about 6,000 years BC. The two Grimaldi skulls, one of a woman and the other a boy, are not Negro skulls. They merely show Negro features. So the enigma depends. All evidence points to the Negro being a comparatively recent race, and here is the old Caucasian race in a continuous stretch from Britain to India, and yet on the other side of India are Negroes. Please. Professor Jeffries constantly placed great emphasis on the word Negro. 10 times in 2 paragraphs he used it, indicating each time the extent of his Negrophobia and the obsession that drove him in that direction, but still not satisfied with his obvious state of confusion and deep racism. Jeffries reached his climax when he wrote, "Now in Africa there is continuous evidence, unlike elsewhere on the globe, of man's uninterrupted occupation of the earth for close on 1,000,000 years. Africa is thus today accepted by many scientists as the cradle of human species. Thus, in Africa from the old Stone Age to modern time, modern man is the tool maker. Nowhere is the Negro, unlike the Bushman, associated with any of these Stone Age cultures. One can readily see why Professor Jeffries has so many problems in finding why most scientists concluded that Negroes' homeland Africa around the Great Lakes regions and the Nile Valley from Tanzania in Central East Africa to the Mediterranean Sea and North Africa is the cradle of human beings, black, white, brown, yellow, red, or whatever else civilization. This is more so true even though he failed to note that the indigenous Africans, not only dark-skinned, but also black, which he preferred to call Negroes, were included on his side of the anthropological and genealogical racial scale among his light and dark-skinned Caucasians, for he included among them the Cushites, Ethiopians, Nubians, Sudanese, the Kenyans, Egyptians, presently Africans, Arabized Africans, Arabs, and a combination of African, Asian, European mixture of people. If this description is adequate for human beings, Messiahs and others renamed Bantus around Tanzania to Mano Matapa, South Africa, who resides along the more than 4,100 mile length and breadth of the Nile Valley from Uganda and Central Africa to Egypt at the Mediterranean Sea. He also concluded the Rozwis, descendants of the builders of the stone structures of the great Zimbabwe, notoriously renamed Southern Rhodesia in the honor of Adolf Hitler of colonial Africa, who murdered more Africans than Hanan and Hitler combined murdered European Jews, and the Swazis and Sathos of Mano Matapa, South Africa, in order to lay claim on Tanzania's fossil man, Zenjan Bosi, Mano Matapa's Blackman man, and Zimbabwe's Broken Hill man as members or forerunners of his dark-skinned Caucasian race. Professor Jeffries was able somewhat to camouflage his racially impregnated non-scientific jargon by virtue of the quotation marks, but he should have realized that in this case he was only proving that his light and dark-skinned Caucasians, especially the light ones, had no historical past into antiquity and ancient cultural greatness. Western civilization, without the inclusion of a vast number of indigenous Africans, he selected to label Negroes and Bantus, including Africans descended from others who were most responsible for the early education of the first and greatest of the light-skinned Caucasian race. The people of Hellas, otherwise known as the Greeks. It is therefore regrettable, it appears, that his learned professor must have not read very much about the early Greeks' physical description of black, broad-nosed, thick lips, and woolly-haired Egyptians, Colchians, Nubians, and Ethiopians, who taught the earliest light-skinned Caucasians, from whom he sprang. As such, it is understandable why he had to claim some of his Sudanic and Bantu-speaking Negroes as his dark-skinned Caucasian relatives of his ancient past, while rejecting them as the cousins they are at the present 20th century CE. It is very much apparent that Professor Jeffries must have forgotten more than the history of how and from who the earliest Europeans, Greeks, and Romans received their education. He also overlooked the fact that the Greek and Roman life, cultures, or civilization had been patterned by the training the Greeks and Romans received in Africa from the Africans, the so-called Negroes and Bantus included, and from the Greeks and Romans all of Europe's other civil compacts developed. Thus, it is clearly shown that from this African, Sudanic, and Bantu background, his so-called modern man originated. This is recorded evidence written by the professor's own earliest light-skinned Caucasians, both Greek and Romans, but maybe Professor Jeffries would prefer to revise the earliest Greeks and Romans wrote about their apprenticeship under the indigenous Africans, Negroes, Bantus, to suit his own racism and prejudices he demonstrated in his writings. The professor's hypothesis of his modern man is endorsed by thousands of racist educators and authorities on Africa and African peoples of the Caucasian race, all of whom demand that they be recognized by African people everywhere as sole authority on everything African. Yet all of them have equally failed to explain what is meant by Negro features in the two Grimaldi skulls found in Monomotapa, Southern Africa. Before further and much more extensive research is undertaken in this area, one needs the privilege of hearing a few comments from a slightly opposite point of view by another light-skinned Caucasian right on the subject, Sir Harry H. Johnson, as he wrote in his work, A History of the Colonization of Africa, page 2. There are certain anatomical differences between existing Negroes of Asia and Oceania on the one hand and the Negroes of modern Africa on the other. Whether the African Negro was the first human colonizer of Africa or was preceded by more brutish or more generalized type, such as the Galley Hill man, it is not yet known to us. But from the little we possess in the way of fossil human remains and other evidence, it seems probable that every region of Africa, even Algeria and Egypt, once possessed a Negro population. The Mauritania, Morocco, to Tripolitania, these ancient Negroes were partly driven out by prehistoric Caucasian invaders and partly absorbed by intermarriage, the mixture resulting in the darkened complexion of the North African people. In Egypt, a dwarfish type of Negro seems to have inhabited the Nile Delta some 10,000 years ago, and big black Negroes formed the population of Upper Nubia and Dongola as late as about 4,000 years ago. One has to note that Johnson was very careful to overlook the absorption of this so-called Negro in Southern Europe, Western Europe, and Great Britain. He seemed to have forgotten that as late as 711 CE, big black Negroes were being absorbed by the thousands throughout Iberia and southern France, from there into other parts of Europe, and finally into the British Isles, including England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Neither in Sir Harry H. Johnson analysis or in Professor N.D.W. Jeffries' wide and sweeping unscientific statements can one find the necessity for determining why proof of the Africans, also called Negroes, origin in Africa is so utterly important, unless it is to justify all of the ruthless racial prejudice and bigotry being still demonstrated daily by the overwhelming majority of Professor Jeffries' light-skinned Caucasians, educators, and writers against their defenseless African victims for over the past 400 years. One must be reminded of the fact that Sir Harry H. Johnson's conclusion rely heavily upon the theories expounded by Sir Arthur Keith and W.L.H. Duckworth. Therefore, as was to be expected, each compounded the other's prejudiced misinformation. It seemed that the compilation of errors was accomplished in too many instances in the writings of these two men, Sir Harry and Professor Jeffries. However, as a historian or anthropologist, Professor Jeffries must be separated somewhat from Sir Harry. For all evidence points to the fact that Sir Harry based some of his conclusions, apparently not very much, upon certain scientific analysis, he claimed, which came partly from his own historical data and the actual examination of certain human remains, fossils. He then let the facts, distorted as they were and still are, prevail as he saw them. On the other hand, Professor Jeffries presented no apparent evidence, scientific or otherwise, to support any of his conclusions in the entitled article. Nowhere in the professor's theories has he submitted any statistical data necessary for scholarship credibility. Yet, no one should slightly dispel Professor Jeffries' apparently racist and unscientific conclusions. No, to dispel them solely on the basis that they are without scientific evidence or historical facts would not be sufficient. Historical evidence through data and scientific facts to the contrary, using substantially varied sources of authoritative works, must be presented. Due to an abundance of credible materials on African history and high cultures, it will not be difficult to accomplish this goal. The goal is reached throughout an entire text of this volume. Before referring to certain other universally recognized European and European American writers, historians, and general scholars on African studies, one must again refer to Sir Harry H. Johnson, who earned the Honorable SCD at Cambridge University for his extensive scientific and historical explorations and research on the subject of Africa. He once wrote, "The successor and supplanter of Homo primigenius in Western Europe is a generalized type of Homo sapien represented by the Negroid strain has never been completely eliminated in these lands." H.G. Wells, in his book A Short History of the World, page 59, apparently supporting Sir Harry H. Johnson's position, wrote, "Three main regions and three main kinds of wandering and imperfectly settled people there were in those remote days of the first civilizations in Sumeria and early Egypt. Away in the forests of Europe were the blond Nordic peoples, hunters and herdsmen, a lowly race. The primitive civilization saw very little of this race before 1500 BC. It should be quite obvious to everyone that while those who cherish Professor Jeffries' outlook on history and who would remove every trace of the indigenous Africans, the so-called Sudanic and Bantu-speaking Negroes, from North, East, and even certain parts of South Africa, Al-Kubalan, cannot even remove the pronounced Negro African strain in themselves or other fellow Europeans and European American peoples, especially of the Mediterranean Europeans, physical appearance, nor from the lightest blonde of Professor M.D.W. Jeffries' light-skinned Caucasian race. The Nordic people, within the same scope of logical reasoning, the grandson of the Victorian scientist of world fame, Sir Charles Darwin, found himself honored and also named Sir Charles Darwin. A scientist of note in his own rights, wrote an article entitled "The Next Million Years," in which he stated that the average skin color of the human race will get darker, and furthermore, economic and military power in Africa and Asia will wrest the leadership from Europe. The late C.P. Snow, in his comments on Sir Charles Darwin's statement, wrote in Johns O. London's Weekly the following: "It seems incidentally that the race discrimination, which has been the least credible feature of the period of white homogeny, is not wicked. It is worse than wicked. It is criminally foolish. One must return to Professor M.D.W. Jeffries' remark, since he seems to have been the champion and most quoted social cultural anthropologist of those who remove all Negro indigenous African people from North and East Africa's ancient and present history and high culture civilization. It is to be equally noted that the professor was also contradicted by Sir Harry H. Johnson on the theory of the Indians, indigenous people of India, Southern Asia. also being dark-skinned Caucasians. Sir Harry Johnson wrote the West Africans Review, page 3, September 1951, the following: "There is a strong underlying Negro element in the mass of the Indian population, and in the southernmost part of the Great Peninsula, there are forest tribes of dark-skinned and strikingly Negro features with frizzled or woolly hair. There is a Negro element in gentle Burgundy and in the Andaman Islands, geologically little more than a depressed peninsula of further India. The dwarfish people are absolute Negroes of the Asiatic type. In the more eastern among the Malay Islands, especially in ɓɛn, Gilolo, and Timor, the interior tribes are of obvious Negro stock, still more marked in the case of New Guinea, and most of all in the Bismarck Archipelago and northern Solomon Islands. In these, last resemblance of the natives to the average Negro of Africa is most striking. Although the distance is something like 8,000 miles, Negro affinities extended east of the Solomon Archipelago to Fiji and Hawaii and south of New Caledonia, Tasmania, and New Zealand. On the other hand, Africa for many thousands of years has been obviously the chief domain of the Negro. It is not strange that Sir Harry H. Johnston could not see the obvious Negro element in the mass of the European and British population in the southernmost part of the great Mediterranean sea coast of Europe, where the Africans even became emperors, and from whence thousands of African Negroes were exported into Britain to pacify Britons who were not even fit to be slaves. One would better understand the position of Sir Harry H. Johnston in the above article as he wrote it for the West African Review, page 3, September 1951, for a European reading public on the African continent. Those who have had the privilege of traveling in the areas of the world mentioned by Sir Harry H. Johnson and Professor M.D.W. Jeffries, also in Europe and Great Britain, including Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, and here in the United States of America, have seen the evidence of Sir Harry's statement. Such proof is most definitely opposed to Professor Jeffries. Moreover, history reminds mankind of the role the Africans, Negroes, played in Persia during the period of the civilization of the Kingdom of Elam, a civilization, high culture, which the indigenous Africans established in Persia of antiquity. It seems that Professor Jeffries had also forgotten that the Ganges River in India got its name from the famous Ethiopian General Ganges, who captured and ruled that area with thousands of Ethiopian Negro troops. Maybe the Ethiopians are also to be considered among Professor Jeffries' dark-skinned Caucasians. They are also part and parcel of the ancient peoples who once ruled Upper, Middle, and Lower Egypt, Tamari, Kemet, Sais, etc., and much of the so-called Middle East, India, Persia, and Arabia, also Palestine and Israel. If so, the peoples of the entire Nile Valley up to Uganda should be equally considered and designated as such. C. B. Rogers, World Great Men of Color. Introduction to African Civilization. Sir E. A. Wallace Bulge, Nubia and Ethiopia. Count C. F. Volney's Ruins of Empire. E. B. Sanford's Mediterranean World. Ben-Jochannan's African Mother of Western Civilization. The so-called Negroes who have become such a dilemma to the light-skinned Caucasians, modern man, of Professor Jeffries, that now practically every university in America and Europe has overindulged in the studies of African Negro history and high culture. Of course, this trend would have been a blessing if the materials on hand, and most of them were of good quality, and providing the documents of quality among the mass-produced editorialized history books would be used in the preparation of current and future teachers in African and Black studies. But how can the administrators of famous European and European American universities and other institutions of higher learning, whose main goals appears to be the perpetuation of their own archaic teaching about Africa and her peoples, wrong or right, come in contact with teachers or professors who are versed in African studies, who are free of Christian missionaries, paternalism, and void of the Tarzan and Jane or Henry Morton Stanley Darkest Africa syndrome. To have expected Europeans and or European Americans of any economic persuasion whatsoever, capitalists, communists, socialists, and any of the religious affiliations, Jews, Christian, Muslims, etc., before the mid-19th century CE, to teach black history from a point of African or African American interpretation, when in fact black people, Negroes, everywhere were beginning to surface their violent revolution to rid themselves of all controls by the same European and European American educators, would be nothing more than an exercise in futility and wishful thinking. In conjunction with the above remarks, we find one of the authorities on Africa and her peoples, the learned Professor C.P. Groves, in his 4-volume work, The Planting of Christianity in Africa, Volume 1, Page 1. It is the paradox of this vast continent, Africa, that while sharing in the earliest history of the human race, it was yet not opened up until the late 19th century. Professor Groves' assertion that Africa yet was not opened up, etc., it is typically the same position held by most of Professor Jeffrey's light-skinned Caucasian academians, especially those who prefer to be called white liberals. On the subject of Africa and indigenous Africans, for the openly professed white liberal Africans, European and European American educators and authors still find it extremely difficult to write or speak in defense of the indigenous Africans and Africa without first asserting their own feeling of superiority in the background. The practice of paternalism, common among all missionaries and colonist settlers, is the order of the day throughout Professor Groves' declarations in his books. Africa's isolation, if ever such was the case, was the right of its indigenous people, but the truth is that there has never been a period in man's history when Africa was not yet opened up to all. It seems that any place where a European or European American has never been is undiscovered, closed, secretive, dangerous, primitive, and not opened up. However, the first of their appearance at any place inhabited by people other than their own ethnic group suddenly becomes safe, discovered, opened up, and that all is worthy of their God's grace. Not only was Africa opened up to all of mankind, including Europeans, Africans carried her civilizing, cultural influences into Europe by the way of her ancient and glorious sons and daughters of Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia, Libya, Carthage, Numidia, and other nations before there was a Jesus Christ, much less Christianity, for Groves to be able to plant it in Africa. Africa, once again, during the beginnings of the Christian era, 711 CE or AD, sent her sons from the northwest, the Moors, as late as the closings of the 15th century CE, when the last of the African or Negro Moors were finally driven out of Grenada, Spain. Indigenous Africans were still civilizing Professor Groves' Christian Europeans, Jeffrey's light-skinned Caucasian race, with their own homeland, the continent called Europe.